According to some newly released data from rentals.ca, the average rent in Halifax has increased by 18% since this time last year. But how the heck is that possible? There's a 5% rent cap in the province, and that's been in place since 2020, and it started at 2%. And then in January 2024, they increased it to 5%, and they extended that rent cap to the end of 2025. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about the rent cap and some of the hard truths, and I'm going to discuss how it's possible for our rents to go up on average by 18% year over year, even though we're on a rent cap. Now, just before I get into it, if you're new here, my name's Andrew Stephens. I'm a realtor in Halifax, and if you want to be educated on the Halifax real estate market, then you're in the right place. So hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. And if you're thinking about making a move in the HRM and you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out to me anytime in the Calendly link below. So according to the rentals.ca August report, our average rent has gone up 18% year over year and now sits at $2,373, which is only 6th on this list behind Vancouver, Toronto, Mississauga, Burlington, and Victoria. We are the only municipality from the Atlantic provinces on the top 25 average rent list in this report. Now, there are varying opinions about the rent cap, and whether you agree or not that it should be in there in the first place, I think we can all agree that if this rent cap was removed, it would put a lot of tenants in a very, very bad spot. Let's face it, let's say you're on a unit that is on the rent cap and you're paying a much lower rent than the market value. Let's say you're paying $800 a month or $900 a month or even $1,200 or $1,400 a month for an apartment in Halifax. As soon as that rent cap comes off, and let's say your landlord ups it to market value rents, a lot of those tenants will be priced out immediately and they would have to leave to search for more affordable housing. But the hard truth is that's basically impossible right now, at least in the private sector, and even in the public sector, there's a huge backlog. So it's really a very difficult thing to do right now in terms of finding affordable housing. So if you're on the rent cap and then you get off of it, the problem is going to be a very big one, and not just for a few people, for a lot of people across the HRM and across the province of Nova Scotia. When you look at the private market, rents are sky high, the cost of building is sky high, and the amount of skilled laborers that we have to build these homes or housing units is not nearly where it needs to be. And this is a huge reason why the rents have gone up as much as they have. Land prices, taxes, development fees, labor costs, labor shortages, material costs, and material shortages have all been major hurdles for developers, and it's affecting their ability to build affordable housing. There's a reason that all the rents in these new apartment buildings being built are crazy expensive. And in all honesty, it's because building is crazy expensive. And there's so many fees and taxes and all these things that are all lumped into the overall cost of building apartment buildings and building housing. And that is just funneled down directly to the rents that the tenants are going to be paying. When you look at the public sector, the supply is rock bottom. Remember when the province didn't build any public housing for 30 years? Yep, well, here we are. And yes, they have done a ton of announcements lately in terms of things they're going to be doing. And recently it was 222 new public housing units they're going to build in the province. But I read an article recently that talked about how many of these projects have actually been completed when most of them were announced in the summer and fall of 2023. And it was nowhere near what they had promised, and it's way behind as per usual with the government. So the reality is the only metric that's going to help our housing situation is housing completions. We can start as many of these projects, we can announce as many of these projects as we want, but until some of them are built with people living in them, it's not going to make an ounce of difference into what we're seeing on the ground level in terms of the shortage of housing on both the private and public sector sides. According to the 5-year housing plan released by the province in October of 2023, we're currently in a deficit of about 27,000 housing units, which is expected to grow to 71,000 housing units by 2027. Now, if you look at the 10-year average, we are building on average about 4,000 housing units per year across the whole province. In 2023, we barely eclipsed 5,000 new home builds for the first time since 2003. And in looking at the data from Stats Canada all the way back to 1955, the highest amount of new housing units completed per year was in 1986, and it was 7,571 new housing units. So we're 27,000 units short approximately. This is expected to be 71,000 by 2027. We're only building about 4,000 to 5,000 housing units per year in the province, and we're adding over 30,000 people per year to the province. So it's about almost an 8-to-1 ratio in terms of people added versus the housing units that we're building. So I'm no astronaut, but you don't have to be a genius to realize that these numbers are very out of whack, and this situation is not likely to get better anytime in the near future, and it might even get worse before it gets better. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but those are the numbers, those are the stats, they don't lie. That is our current housing crisis situation in Nova Scotia. So in moving back to talk about how rents have increased so much year over year, even when we're on the rent cap, there's a few things to mention. So number one, any of the new construction units are not subject to the rent cap when they're setting their initial market rent prices. So they're determining these prices based off the market rents, based on what the market will allow, and also based on what their building costs are. And again, that's a big reason why they're so expensive. So those big rents in those newer buildings, you're talking $2,000 or $2,200 a month for a one-bedroom unit, those bigger rents are bringing up the average overall across the city. There's no doubt about that. Secondly, let's say there's a tenant that's been living in a unit for quite some time and it's subject to the rent cap, and maybe their landlord was nice to them back in the day before the rent cap and didn't increase their rent very much, and maybe they're paying like $900 a month for a unit. Well, if that tenant leaves, then that landlord can then up their rent to whatever they want, and then there's no rent cap in terms of that specific situation. So again, that's something else that's going to bring up that average a lot, because every time a unit comes available that's affordable, it's not going to be affordable when they put it back on the market and get a new tenant in there. So in terms of some food for thought for you, think about this. I've helped in the last few years a ton of first-time home buyers get into new houses. And the truth is, a lot of these people were in apartments that were on the rent cap, and it took them a little while to want to leave because they were paying so little amount at their rental, which was maybe $1,000 a month or $1,200 a month, or even $1,400 a month would be very cheap right now. So when those tenants leave, they buy a house, they leave, that $1,400 a month apartment is likely renting for $1,800 or $2,000 or maybe even $2,200 or $2,400, depending on how nice it is, the location, and the size and the amount of bedrooms. So in this particular example, that increase is obviously much more than 5%. So again, these types of situations are going to bring up those averages, and it's going to bring up those numbers for a report like this one from rentals.ca. Truthfully, there's a lot of people out there still paying reasonable amounts in rent, and they're just staying put because they're on the rent cap. But I run into people all the time through work when I'm showing multi-unit properties and things like this that are paying $700, $800, $900 a month, or maybe it's $1,000, maybe it's $1,200. There's a lot more of them out there than you think. But the reality is, as soon as they leave, there goes an affordable unit for sure, because that landlord is then going to up that rent to get it back to where the market rent average should be. This situation is no doubt causing some tenants to stay put where they're at instead of move, even if they need more space or want more space or want a location change, because the reality is, if they're on the rent cap and they have a lower rent per month, if they move, it's going to go up substantially, right? It's just the reality of it. And also, it's causing a lot of landlords to not want to do any maintenance on the property, and they also want their tenants to leave. So I'm sure they're not being very good landlords in a lot of cases. And shout out to the good landlords. I know there's a lot of you out there, but there's a lot of bad ones as well. So this rent cap situation, while there is a lot of positives, obviously on the tenant side especially, it is causing some issues for tenants and landlords, depending on how you look at it and depending on each individual circumstance. Now again, I know a lot of people are against the rent cap, but there's a lot of people that are for it as well, and it's definitely a tough situation based on where we are now. Truthfully, I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't think it should have been put on in the first place, but now that it's been on there for 4 years, I believe it's very difficult for the government to take it off now, because it would be an absolute train wreck of what would happen to the housing situation. And I think when they increased it to 5% from 2% this January, and then kicked the can down the road and extended it until the end of 2025, that was sort of the parent playing the role of, I'm not taking sides, it's kind of a lose-lose, news, nobody's happy, but we're all living with it. And to be honest, I think it was probably the right situation to make at the time. I recently had a conversation with Eric, who is one of the managers at the Dartmouth Bridge Shelter, and it was really interesting. You can see it up here in top. I'll tag it up here so you can take a look at it. But we just had an open conversation about the housing crisis, and it was really interesting to see things from his side of the coin because he's constantly dealing with people who are struggling to keep a roof over their head. And it was just an interesting angle to hear it from because I often hear it from investors and realtors. And of course, there's a lot of varying opinions depending on what kind of sector you work in and what your overall experience is. But I think that decision overall by the government to increase it was sort of the happy medium. They're showing that, hey, we're going to give landlords a little bit extra here, but we can't give them too much because it's going to be a disaster on the tenants. And, nobody's happy, but we're all sort of living with it. And regardless of what side of the coin you fall on, I think we can all agree that the housing situation in Nova Scotia and in Halifax in particular is an absolute disaster. It just is. It is what it is, and it's likely not going to get better anytime soon. You've heard the numbers that I've mentioned in this video, and again, I just don't see any major changes happening anytime in the near future. Now, if you're still here watching, you obviously have some vested interest in this topic, or maybe you're just waiting to attack me in the comments, and that's okay. Everybody has their opinion. It's all good. But I'm curious, do you think the rent cap should have been put in place in 2020 in the first place? Do you think when it was extended to 2025 that was the right move? And do you think it should be taken off in 2025? Or do you think they should rework it and maybe they tie it into, you can up it for the amount that is accounting for inflation or something like that? There's all kinds of ways they could go about it, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the rent cap. Should it stay? Should it go? Should it be here? Should it not? I'm really curious to know. And if you're still here watching and you got any value out of this video, all I ask is that you hit that like button and you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of my future content. And that'll help push this out to more people like you who may be interested in seeing content about the Halifax housing market. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support and have a great day.